All right, welcome, Africa. Thank you for being here. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Thank you. Me too. Me too. We've been trying to get this to happen for a while now. But I'm very excited because I think there's a lot, even though we do very different things, there's a lot that connects us, especially when it comes to psychology, which I know is going to be a big part of this conversation in different ways. But I've been very excited. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I know you're a busy woman, which maybe is where we
You
can
too.
start. Yeah, we're both busy women.
Yes.
So I think what would be cool is like, I always cringe when people ask me this, but I also think it's an interesting one to ask, is like, how do you describe yourself to people, and especially people who are kind of not in that coaching consultation kind of world?
Yeah. And you're right. It's one of those questions that I think many of us really hesitate to answer, especially if you are someone like me who does more than one thing. If you're someone like me who's kind of an idea generator, so there are so many things that I do in my day-to-day, but the main things that I do is that I'm a consultant and I'm a developmental coach. And I also mentor people. And the simplest way that I can put it is that there are two pillars that hold up the work that I do and what I explore with people. Self-sabotage, which is when you get in your own way. That's the simplest way that I can put it. And then self-censorship, which is a form of self-sabotage, which is when you withhold your ideas, your true opinions, beliefs, because you think you're going to be punished for it in some way. And I mainly do this work with people that are in the public eye, with people that are founders, with people that are hyper visible, because they tend to experience these challenges just in a very, very unique way. But in everything that I share publicly on social media, through my podcast, through conversations like this, they are things that will also resonate people that don't fall under, being in the public eye. But self-censorship and self-sabotage are my two main areas of work.
Nice, cool. And we'll get into those two areas, I think, in a bit more depth. But it'd be cool to know, like, sort of what are some of the like tangible outcomes that you look for when you're working with someone, or that someone comes to you for?
Yes, a lot of it is to do with communication, if not all of it. How do I become a better communicator? How do I be more effective when I'm communicating? How do I cultivate emotional resilience? How do I cultivate mental resilience, which I know is a big part of what you do in a very practical way, but also mentally and emotionally. So a lot of it is about cultivating resilience and becoming a better communicator. And it just looks different from person to person. Sometimes it's also to do with business strategy, because when you are sabotaging yourself in your personal life, there's a big chance that you're also sabotaging yourself in the business sense, if you're an entrepreneur or if you're someone that has a project. So a lot of it is about, some people might come to me thinking that I have a business problem, but actually it's a very, very personal problem. But I would say the through line with all of this is how I become a better and more effective communicator, especially in the climate that we're in today, where people constantly feel like they're walking on eggshells. People are terrified of saying the wrong thing. We have a very identity-first approach, especially in the Western world, which means that diversity of thought is never really at the table. But that's in direct contradiction with how we are as human beings, because diversity of thought is the default of how we are. So at the core of it, it's about communicating. How do I become a more effective and braver communicator?
Nice, great. I think it might be interesting for people to know, like not in crazy depth, because I know that we have a bit of a timeline here, but it would be cool to just get a bit of a sense of how you got to be in this position with your career and what you do. In some ways, what you're talking about seems really niche, and in other ways, it seems like something that affects us all in some sense or another. But yeah, I know, because I know that there were certain things in your childhood and being an immigrant into the UK at a young age have been
Mm.
quite important for shaping how you got to where you are.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the way you position that as well, because you're so right in terms of what I'm talking about can actually sound very niche. And I think that's because of the language. Not many people will walk around, well, oh, I'm self-sabotaging again, or I'm self-censoring. The language is very the language is not the way that most people speak, you know. But intuitively, it's something we all know. Once you say, for example, getting in your own way, or that your behavior and your actions are actually not in alignment, and you're finding yourself just getting the results you don't want, you're finding yourself um, almost pulling the plug on your vision. Let's say when you get close to doing something, and then suddenly you have all of these excuses as to why it's not ready, why it's not time. Your internal chatter is constantly talking you out of the things that you want to do. When you explain it in that way, you realize that actually we all experience it in different ways. So I will start with self-sabotage, because it's one of the first things that I was able to really see that I was doing, one of the things that I was able to put language to. And that started when I was 24, when I got sober. I, without giving too much of the details because it would take far too long, I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and I came to the UK when I was 9 years old. So I'm 30 years old at the time of this recording. I came when I was 9 years old. And it was a very, how do I even explain this? It was a very startling experience for me, because 9 years old is very young, but it's still old enough to be able to remember certain things. It's still old enough to be familiar with the environment that I grew up in Zimbabwe, where everyone around me was like me, whether it's because of the language that I speak, the color of my skin, just the specifics of the culture that I'm from. The home that I grew up in, I grew up in a very traditional African home with a mother and a father, and religion was a big part of our upbringing. But what made it unique, but also not very unique, was that my father was an alcoholic. So it was a home where abuse was sort of the default, physical abuse and emotional abuse. But something that I always say is that within that framework, and in that family of origin, is where I really learned how to hold multiple truths as a young person, as a child, which will be very important and is important in the rest of my story, because my father could be all of these horrible things, but he could also be wonderful. He could also be very charming. He could be really interesting and very curious about all of us. But when he drank, he could be the complete opposite. And as much as I learned to hate him, I also learned to love him, you know. So it was a very complex thing that, of course, I didn't have the language that I have now. But I realized that everything that took place in my childhood has shaped the way that I view the world today. So came to the UK at 9 years old. And by the time that I was a teenager, I was very much immersed in British culture. And a big part of British culture is the way people relate to alcohol, the way people drink, the way alcohol is seen as and I can see the recognition on your face that you're familiar with what I'm talking about. The way that drinking, especially binge drinking, is just seen as a rite of passage. So that's something that I fell into quite quickly from 14 is when I had my first drink. But also the history of my father being an alcoholic and the relationship that he had had with alcohol, that had also seeped into my subconscious in more ways than I would have known at the time. So that pairing of the family that I had grown up in, and probably one of the most influential people in my life, my father, having a destructive relationship with alcohol, and then me being in an environment where things like drinking and having a very unhealthy relationship with alcohol was kind of normalized on a societal level. That pairing just led me into a decade of total self-sabotage, a decade of complete self-destruction from the age of 14 up until I finally got sober when I was 24. And it's not to say that I didn't know that I had a problem. The time I was about 17, I knew that there was something that wasn't quite normal about the way that I drank. Um, I blipped out pretty much every single time. I didn't know how to have just one drink. In fact, I didn't want to. And I don't know many teenagers that sort of drink so they can savor the taste and the notes of the wine. It's you're drinking to get fucked up. But that's the way that I had trained myself for every single occasion. So it didn't really matter anymore if I was actually just in a park with my friends, if I was in a party, or if I was just at a baby shower, or if I was around the table with my family. I had trained myself to drink in a very specific way. And that was the way that I drank for a decade. And there was a lot of fallout that came with that, whether it was to do with my own mental health, my own emotional health, not being able to stay in a job for longer than a month, or turning up to work very hungover or still drunk, being in a blackout and lying, over exaggerating my life because I felt very inadequate, promising that I would follow through with certain things and then just not doing it because I was extremely unreliable, but also I wouldn't remember what I had committed to in the morning. So there would just be so many things that over time just became impossible to hide, and my life was falling apart because of it. So I tried to get sober consciously from the age of 19 up until 24. And I relapsed 7 times, and they were very, very big relapses. There was a lot of shame that came with it, but I still was not able to break the cycle. I didn't have the language that I have now. I didn't have the self-awareness that I have now. I have always been a curious person, so I would search on Google, is it normal to drink this much? What happens when you're in a blackout? Just questions that someone would ask if they are at that point of desperation almost, or that knowing that something isn't quite right. When I was 24, when I finally got sober, something did shift, because my curiosity led me to a place of just falling deep into the world of psychology, where I suddenly had all of this language, where I understood for the first time that it wasn't actually a moral failing in the way that I thought it was. I wasn't doing this to myself because I truly hated myself. There was something happening on a chemical brain-based level. Addiction. I was able to understand addiction in a way that I just hadn't before. I was able to realize that there are things that I'm able to change. It is possible for me to get sober, even though I've relapsed so many times. And then I came across the concept of self-sabotage. When what you say you want, I said that I wanted to get well, I said that I didn't want to do this anymore, is in direct contradiction with your behavior. My behavior was that I was still continuing to drink. I was still continuing to lie and to manipulate and to cheat on partners and to make promises that I wouldn't follow through with, and to commit to jobs that I would walk away from a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. Always having big visions and dreams. I've always been a very creative person, an artistic person, a dreamer, but I would never follow through with any of it, but I would lie to the people around me about what I was doing. So my behavior was just pushing me further and further away from myself, but also from other people. A lot of people walked away silently, but some walked away loudly. So finding the concept of self-sabotage, and again, suddenly having language for this thing, because once I have the language, then I'm able to explore it, then I'm able to find the antidote for it. And it also helped me connect to other people. So I started sharing my story of getting sober on social media, because I am of that age, and especially at that time when Instagram was just a very different platform, which is where I started sharing. It was still very open. People were not worried about being cancelled all the time. People were not worried about being misrepresented. It was just an open online diary. The stakes were so low. I didn't have any intention of starting a community or a platform, let alone a business, and doing what I do now. I just needed to get well. It was really that simple. I needed to get well. I didn't know anyone who was sober in my life. I've always been a writer. I've always liked to express myself through words. So I started an anonymous journal, and I was just sharing every single time that I thought I would relapse. I would write about it. I would reflect on previous experiences. I would share beautiful photos of cocktails that I had taken in the past. But in the caption, I would make it very clear that I was romanticizing my disease, you know. And I found that to be really powerful in helping me stay sober. But over time, my story was picked up quite quickly by the British media. I would say about 7 months in, it was picked up by ITV and Lorraine Kelly's team, and I was invited to come and share my story. And because of my age at the time, being 24, and also the identity piece of me being an African immigrant girl, it was a very compelling story, you know, and I understand why. So I was able to start sharing my story openly pretty quickly. But again, I didn't think about it in a strategic way about being in the public eye. I still just needed to get well. It was only 6 months. I had done 6 months before and relapsed. I just continued sharing every single day. And then about a year in, I'd accidentally built a community. I was still immersed in the world of psychology. So anything that I learned, I would come and share it on the platform. I would create conversations, started meeting with people offline. I just realized that I actually have a gift for storytelling. I have a gift for seeing problems and seeing the solution almost immediately, not just for myself, for other people. And then eventually I started getting trainings in specialized areas of psychology because I knew that there was something here, that I do have a powerful voice. Again, there was no big vision of what I do now, but I just knew that there's something here, and this something is going to help me get well, but eventually it might help other people too. So I'll kind of park it there, and then you can tell me where you want to take this, but that's kind of as neatly and as concisely as I can sort of present where I was before and what started to lead me into the work that I do today.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I've obviously listened to a lot of your stuff, your podcast and stuff, but there was things in there that I didn't know, so that was interesting for me. What comes
really?
to yeah. Especially the bit about the media picking up your story. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Yeah, what comes to mind is like concepts around confidence and self-worth come up for me quite a bit there, because I don't know if you know this about me, but there's been quite a lot of addiction in my family. And luckily, my brother has now been sober for I think 6 years, so actually similar path to you. Yeah.
Yes.
But what really strikes me with recovering addicts and how it must be hard to stay sober is that there probably is a lot of shame around some of the things you've done in your past. And there's probably not been, as an addict, a lot of opportunities to build confidence and a lot of threat to self-worth. And we kind of think of confidence and self-worth as like the foundations for a successful person, right? Like it's hard to be a successful person, especially a visible successful person, without these foundations of confidence and self-worth. So I'd be interested to know sort of like how you were able to rebuild that and like think well of yourself, despite the fact that you had for so long been self-sabotaging and sort of, in the ways you describe, like maybe not necessarily being an honest person or a reliable person, a loyal person, like your relationships were often under threat. So yeah, it'd just be interesting to see like what that looked like in your recovery, and also whether there's still work left for you to do there as well.
Oh, I love that. I really like that, because you're right. The confidence and self-worth piece is huge, especially when, and then I'm very curious to know even just your own relationship with these two areas, because they are huge. And I think when we hear words like confidence and self-worth, they can sound kind of like, yeah, sure. They can sound kind of surface level. And I think they don't have the same charge that maybe they did at a point in time. But for me, they've had to be just a non-negotiable practice. They just had to be. And you know what? One of the biggest things I would say, Hazel, is that finally having the language for my experience allowed me to even start that journey of becoming more confident and realizing that I'm worthy. Because that thing that I said about realizing that my addiction was not a moral failing was huge, because I truly believe that this is just who I am. Because I also had those ideas of my father of this is just who he is. And he died at 40 years old before he could get sober. He died because of alcohol. And I saw the worst of him. And I really got to experience his decline. Me and my siblings and my mother and the rest of our family did. And because alcohol was a huge contributing factor to that decline, when I started to have my own destructive relationship with it, I was projecting my father's experience onto myself, that this was just who I am. And I had the evidence for it, right? By relapsing so many times. So suddenly having that objective language of self-sabotage, the science of addiction, what actually happens to the brain, and also something that I always say, seeing what celebrities were able to get sober really fucking helped me. Seeing that someone who had struggled with addiction for like a decade or 20 years or 30 years and they were able to get sober, other people's stories were so helpful. Other people reading or even hearing other people saying, I used to be a fuck up and I changed my life. But the key component of that was also taking responsibility. I wouldn't have been able to be as confident in myself and truly believed myself and the part that I was on if I had just said, it's not a moral failing and I get to change and people have to accept it. I had to take responsibility for everything that I had done. I had to reach out to people and make amends. Even though I didn't go through the 12-step route, I really borrowed from that in terms of actually reaching out to people, making amends, and not being over attached to the outcome. That really helped me with my self-confidence. So for me, it wasn't things like saying affirmations in the mirror. Things like that don't really work for me. I need things that are actually concrete. I need things that actually stretch me and challenge me. So for me, taking personal responsibility allowed me to become more confident. Having the language to describe my experience allowed me to become more confident. Reminding myself that I'm still worthy. But to me, that would have still even sounded a little too fluffy. What actually makes me worthy? What makes me worthy is that even though I've done all of these fucked up things, I'm still a very good sister. I'm a very good daughter. I care about my nieces and nephews. I'm able to advise my friends. I'm able to be there for them. I'm a very good communicator when I'm sober. I'm a very open person. So I needed actual evidence to show me that I'm worthy, not just me saying it. So all of these things really did help me build my confidence, but there was no destination and there's still no destination for it. It's a constant practice of becoming a more confident and grounded person. And for me, taking responsibility and accountability for myself really holds that up. So yeah, so confidence and self-worth have been and will continue to be a constant practice.
Nice, yeah. It's interesting. Taking responsibility comes up a lot in the coaching work I do with climbers. It's actually always a lesson
Right.
in almost every course that we've done. It's a lesson in there, and strangely, I think of it as almost this like throwaway thing. Like it's not, no, I don't think of it like that.
Mm,
But sometimes I can forget how powerful it is. And then people do that lesson or they give us feedback on the courses and they're like, that was still the most powerful lesson for me. And what
wow.
I hear is actually, it's almost half the work is done when you really take responsibility and you're like, no matter what it is that you're doing, whether it's climbing or your profession or anything, if there's something that you want to change and you don't take responsibility, it's a
Yes.
non-starter.
Right.
But what was interesting to me is when listening to your story, you were like hearing that the science of addiction or studying the science of addiction almost takes responsibility away from you, right? Because you're basically sort of
Mm,
saying, these are chemicals in my brain. This is how I am. I'm not a bad person. I don't have this moral failing. But then you also said it was
mm-hmm.
really important to take responsibility. And it's the same with anything. It's like you want people to take responsibility. You want to take responsibility yourself, but you also need to have self-compassion there.
Right.
And so there's this balance, isn't there, between like empowerment on one side and victimization on the other, also blame on one side.
Mm.
Because what's the difference between taking responsibility and self-blame? And
Yes,
so there's all
yes,
that going on.
exactly.
And then we're also kind of in this moment in society where victimization language comes up a lot, right? And especially
Yes.
someone with your story, you could easily see you as a victim, right? As someone
Mm-hmm.
who
Mm-hmm.
suffered trauma early on in childhood, who came to a different
Yes.
country, was probably subject to racial prejudice and othering because
Mm-hmm.
you moved to a very white area of the UK. So
Yeah.
how do you balance all that, right? Like how do you hold that and find the route through it all that's like most empowering for you and for your
Mm.
personal development?
Yeah. You just brought something so potent to the table, and I was writing as you were speaking, and I'll kind of just touch on first on what you were saying about how being in that place of research and exploration to find the language, you can easily start to outsource, right? You would analyze, and it can give you that permission slip you need to justify things that you might have done in the past. And I see that all the time. But for me, that just would have never felt fulfilling. It just would never have felt entirely true. And I think it's because of how broken everything around me was, because it just wouldn't have made absolute sense for me to just be looking at the science and the research. But I've fucked up so many relationships around me. I've had 4 jobs in the past 3 months. I live in the same home with my siblings and my mother, and no one speaks to me, because of how much destruction that I've caused. I can't bring them the data and the science, and it wouldn't have made sense. So surely there's something else happening here. So that's why the personal responsibility piece was so freeing for me. And also, you're so right in that even when I think of the media finding my story and me getting to tell my story, another thing that does make it compelling is that victim angle, right? Is that victim of kind of all the entire checklist of immigrant, Black, young, alcoholic father, trying to better her life, doesn't have anyone to speak to, has to turn to the internet because there's no one to speak to, doesn't have anyone left, has been given an ultimatum by her boyfriend. I mean, like it's fantastic. It's
Yeah.
brilliant. It's brilliant.
When's your Hollywood movie coming out?
I mean, as I say it out loud, I think I need to get on the phone because
Yeah.
that's pretty fucking good.
Well, don't worry, they'll listen to this podcast, obviously, and then, they'll take it from there.
But you know what I admire, Hazel, about my younger self is that I didn't fall neatly into that victim role. Now, when I really think about it and when I compare it to the work that I do today and what has led me to what I explore today, I never allowed myself to be painted as the victim. I just didn't. I always said, even in interviews, when you go back to interviews from 6, 7 years ago that I did, they're still very much in line with the way that I speak now. I was able to be very honest about everything that I've experienced, being an immigrant, my father being the way that he was, etc. but I never wore that as kind of like this armor that I'm going to shield myself with for the rest of my life, to evade any kind of responsibility or acknowledging where I have fucked up and my contributions, where I have lied, where I have manipulated, where I have cheated, which has nothing to do with my father, which has nothing to do with being an immigrant, which has nothing to do with any of those things. There was something fundamentally within me, and this was a big realization when I got sober, because I thought on some level, I thought by stopping drinking, all of it is just to go away. And now I'm going to be a good person. But no. I was just shown that actually the alcohol wasn't entirely to blame for this, you know. So from the beginning, I've always been very clear of the part that I have played. I haven't allowed myself to fall into the role of victim. I think subconsciously, I probably played up to it a little bit, because the reality is that there are a lot of benefits to that. There are a lot of benefits to having this very neat story, you know. But I never allowed myself to fully be wrapped up into it to the point where I don't talk about the parts that I have played. I've always been very upfront about that. And I think I actually thank my family and how I was raised for that. Naturally, there are a lot of traits and ways of being that come naturally to people that are immigrants, people that have experienced adversity and hardship, people that have had to adjust from one culture and go straight into another, where there's no time to hyper focus on your emotions. And there's a shadow aspect to that. There's no time to see yourself as a victim. We have to survive. We have to make things work. There is no money. So my mum has to be working all the time. From a young age, me and my siblings had to look after each other, regardless of how young we were. There's a resilience that's kind of inbuilt in you, that there's really no fucking time to see yourself as a victim. So by the time it came to me getting sober and talking about it publicly, talking about the things that I've experienced, even the abuse, it was never my natural instinct to kind of wallow and to see myself as a victim. And I think there was that training from how I grew up, you know. So by the time that I started to see, especially in the Western world, by the time that I got older and I've been sharing online for some time, and I'm starting to get recognized, which means naturally people are starting to reach out to me because of that identity first approach. I'm falling into the world of social justice, because there's activism that comes with speaking about sobriety and the alcohol industry. There is an inherent activism that comes with that, because you're pushing back against something that is widely accepted. You're pushing back against something that is tied to the system that we live under. So I eventually found myself naturally falling into activist spaces because of what I was doing with my sobriety work. But again, I didn't see myself as a victim. I saw that there was a problem happening culturally, and I could do something to address it on a subjective but also objective level. And the influence that I was starting to have, naturally, I was finding myself in spaces where I got to do that work on a bigger level. So that journey of seeing that even though I didn't see myself as a victim, I was finding myself in spaces where I was being seen as a victim and being told that I have to see myself as a victim, is when I started to kind of experience self-censorship, which again, as I mentioned in the very beginning, is a big part of the work that I do today, and I explore it in different ways. But I started to notice that other people wanted me to see myself as a victim, and I would end up subconsciously playing up to it sometimes, but I didn't want to do that. But there was also opportunity that came with it at times, which I didn't realize consciously, but that was just the reality of it. So I almost didn't have to, but chose to perform victimhood in different ways so that I could fit in with my community, so that I could fit in with the groups that I was a part of. But again, at my core and who I truly am, I knew that this idea of me being a victim doesn't make sense. It's not what I know myself to be. It's not the truth of my experience. But I felt like I couldn't say that because it would be a betrayal to people in the sobriety community, or it would be a betrayal to other Black people, or insert whatever community here. So that's when I started to experience self-censorship, but again, didn't have the language for it until years later.
Oh wow, there's a lot there. There's a lot there for sure. Maybe we can move into talking more explicitly about that self-censorship.
Yeah.
And but before we do that, like, I think as people are listening, they might be wondering about a little bit more about that victimhood piece.
Yes.
Because I guess it, at the heart of it, it comes back to this kind of balance between compassion and taking responsibility. And in some ways, there's almost a political intuition around that, right? People on the left tend towards compassion, people on the right tend towards taking responsibility. But within us, perhaps there's also this leaning that we might actually, it's almost like we might hold ourselves to different ideals than we might do on like a social level. And I just wondered, like, the way you talk about it, you're obviously like a very empowered person. And has anyone kind of challenged you and said, well, okay, maybe it's worked for you to not see yourself as a victim, but where does that approach bleed into victim blaming, where you're basically saying it's your fault you've not been able to be a successful person. It's you just need to take more responsibility. Where is that line for you? And has anyone challenged you on it because they felt that you had crossed the line into victim blaming?
I think the way that I have always spoken about personal responsibility and taking responsibility has been from the I. It has been from my experience, which has meant that it's been received differently. So sometimes you will see people that maybe live life in a different way and they took responsibility for themselves, and now they're sort of on this pedestal where they're telling everyone else they have to take responsibility. If I can do it, you can do it. That's never been my approach. I don't think it's that simplistic. And I think it's a very self-righteous approach to think that just because something has worked for you, it will work for everyone else. I think there's a reality to the world that we live under and the system that we live under. And, the circumstances that can just vary and do vary from person to person. Even if you've been born in the same household, your experiences can be so different, So for me, I've always, without even being strategic or overly thinking about it too much, I've always been very careful about how I have that conversation on personal responsibility, because I think some people do take it to that extreme where they lack so much empathy and they lack so much compassion and lack so much understanding of the reality that people do live. So I haven't received any pushback around that, because I think I've always spoken about it from the I, and I'm able to speak about it in a way that alienate people, in a way that doesn't point fingers at the victim, because I do think there's a difference, Hazel, between being a victim, have actually experienced something that puts you in a position by default of being victimized. And then victimhood is a very different thing. Victimhood is when someone takes on the identity of a victim, even if they have not been victimized, which I think is the key of what we're speaking about and what we see play out culturally. So even when I speak about things like this, I always like to make that distinction that victims, there's a reality to it, which is why we need to stop using the language of victimhood and making that mean that someone has actually been victimized. We need to be very clear about what we're speaking of. But it's when someone wears it as an identity that I do take issue. But there have been people that have pushed back against me saying, and if anyone is familiar with work, you've seen me talk about this quite a bit, pushed back against me saying that I am not oppressed, that I don't see myself as an oppressed individual. I acknowledge the adversity that I've experienced and might still continue to experience because of my racial identity, because of where I'm from, because of insert the details here, right? But inherently, as an individual, I do not see myself as oppressed, because if I choose to see myself as oppressed by default, I will be walking through the world with that cloak of victimhood. And I just don't find that to be useful for me. But I also make it very clear that me saying that does not take away from the genuine oppression that other people are experiencing. And I think it's pretty fucking absurd that we think if one person says I'm not oppressed, that means you're denying everyone's oppression. That, you know, the binary thinking is pretty ridiculous. So I've had a few people, not even a lot of people, by the way, push back on that main thing. But then when I further clarify what I mean by that, people do understand what I'm saying. But I think it's because any conversation that I have, even if it's a difficult one, I always lead compassion and empathy. And it's not something that I have to say, okay, I'm going to, it's just natural for me because I understand that things are not that simple. So I think I'm able to have challenging conversations in a way that allows people to still kind of have their shoulders relaxed a little bit, even if they don't agree with me, because I'm not trying to project my view of the world onto other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's key, right? Is like if you're not coming from a place of judgment, it just makes such a difference. And I guess that's a trend that we're seeing more often, is especially through social media, is sort of telling people how they should act, telling people how they should think,
right,
and judging them if they don't fall in line. And I think that's something I guess you've talked quite a lot about. And you know, coming back to self-censorship, is that one of the reasons why self-censorship is becoming such an issue in our culture, is because of that judgment, or is it a kind of a chicken and egg situation? I mean, why is this such a important moment in terms of self-censorship right now?
Yeah, I think I love the way you articulate it as, is it a chicken and egg situation? Because I think it kind of is that. I think there's no one neat answer for it. I think, again, if I bring forward the very just clear and simple definition of self-censorship, it's when you withhold your ideas, your opinions, your beliefs, and your true, genuine thoughts out of fear. So you're afraid of being punished in some way, whether that punishment is what we call today cancellation, being misrepresented, being publicly shamed, being doxxed, being just dragged by your neck and hair in the comment sections of social media, or being rejected by your social group, whatever the details might be, you believe on some level, often very unconscious, but it's a visceral feeling, that you are going to be punished for expressing those thoughts. So fear is the grounding force here. And I want to make it very clear that there's a difference between self-censoring, which is driven by fear, and then using what I call a refined social filter, which is when you're grounding yourself in discernment. We call it reading the room. When you can read the room and know that there's a time and a place, this is not the right time to share this with Hazel, she's not the right audience, or she is the right audience, so I can share this thing that might be controversial elsewhere. You have to be able to discern, and we do it all the time. You know, it's a skill that we use without even realizing we're doing it, but it's not grounded in fear, whereas self-censorship is. So those are kind of the differences. If anyone wants to know, well, does that we get to say whatever we want? No. We have to use a social filter, but self-censorship is a very specific thing and is driven by fear. And I think I actually don't think this is sudden and it's come out of nowhere. And, you know, suddenly people are not saying what they think and they're afraid that walking on eggshells. It's not. we're just seeing it manifest differently because of social media. Because now everyone can shout into the void, because now everyone can have an opinion on something. When before, it could have just been localized to your friendship group or the people in your community, maybe the people in your school, maybe the people in your workplace. But now it's anyone and everyone online. So it creates a culture of surveillance where you constantly feel that you're being watched. But where I find it dangerous and why I talk about self-censorship is it's not just isolated to online. People are already doing this in their minds. People are already overly editing their thoughts and monitoring their language in their minds. If you're someone that leans towards the side of being a people pleaser, someone that goes into a fawn response where you just end up agreeing or wanting to appease the person in front of you, or when you're more intimidated by someone, you might end up adopting their beliefs because you think they won't agree with you. There are things that are inherently within us as human beings, but because of the platforms that we're finding ourselves existing on, it's now amplified in a way we just have not seen before. So people are now terrified of sharing. And it doesn't even have to be things that are controversial anymore. It could be something that's so non-controversial. It could be a question. And then you'll be piled on by hundreds of people. And especially if you're someone that's visible, forget about it. Because it's not like you just have 50 followers and maybe 3 people will, ask you why are you asking this? Or it's not, you have hundreds of people that are able to, in seconds or half a second, say something. So it's just making us more and more afraid of expressing ourselves. But for me, and actually before I just expand on that, I'm curious to know just some of the things that I've said around self-censorship, how they land with you, because you are someone that is very much in the public. How have you seen this sort of play out for yourself, whether it's privately or publicly?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been something that I've thought a lot about.
Yeah.
And I definitely, for me, I did notice a change where I felt like about 6, 7 years ago, Instagram was more of a safe place to be curious about certain things. And now it's definitely less of a safe space. And for me, it's come with a trend of like moralizing everything. Whereas in the past, I felt like the climbing community, we were like the alternative community. We kind of sort of did a bit more, there was a bit more freedom of thought. And now it feels like everything's moralized. So like, and I think sometimes when people listen to this stuff, they're like, oh, it's just because you want to say something that's like not left wing, or they instantly think of politics. But I really don't think it is. And I think COVID did worsen it a bit, because it didn't necessarily split down left and right, but there were certain groups that you sort of maybe felt like you had to fall into, sort of like pro-vaccination, or like in the climbing community, it was very much like if you were out climbing, you were doing a disservice to your community because you could meet someone at the crag and potentially pass COVID, these sorts of things, right? And so there's quite a bit of it during COVID. But also, like, for those people who are thinking that this is just about controversial areas, it's not. Like some of my friends who are parents, like even just talking about how they've maybe come back to the sport quite quickly after birth. They're receiving judgment around that, or they're receiving, it's like there is a lot of judgment going on, and it's so much easier to just pull back. And I don't really want to talk about anything controversial on my social channel, so it's not necessarily come up for me. But I'm starting to feel that what I consider to be controversial is, or sort of the thing, like what's controversial is getting pushed out into what was in the past really uncontroversial. So that's like how I've sort of perceived it, is just through the moralization of almost everything. Which I
Yes.
guess, when we think about it, it comes with a more progressive society. When people start to be
Mm,
more in tune with what we should be doing to look after the environment, what we should be doing to look after each other, which are all great things, it comes with this slight dark side, right? Of it
mm-hmm.
being also very judgmental. It's perhaps
Yeah.
some people feel like to be a good citizen is to inform others when they think they're
Mm,
not being good citizens.
yeah.
But they're doing it
Yeah.
in a way that's really not very productive. And perhaps you can shed some more light on this, but there's there's often a self-righteousness there, and an othering, and a sense that it's often about that person feeling better about themselves rather than
Mm,
potentially actually wanting to do good, although there's obviously the whole spectrum there. But that's kind of
yeah.
how I've noticed it, I would say. um yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that, because it's another reminder that, yeah, this is not isolated to any particular group. And you articulated it so well around the moralization of it, and how everything, the interpersonal, has been politicized in a way that I just think most people have not experienced anything like this before,
Mm,
where every single thing can be tied to politics. Anything,
mm,
anything,
mm.
in quite a shocking way.
You wouldn't have thought motherhood we could be politicized, could you? Right.
It's quite mad, quite impressively mad. And sometimes when people say like I'm brave for speaking in the way that I do, and then I really take a moment to think about what I'm saying. It's really not that brave. It's really not that brave at all. I can understand what people mean because of the climate we're in, but that actually is cause for concern for me.
Mm,
That the message that I'm putting forward of, hey, should we, maybe we've gone a little bit too far. Should we kind of rein it in a little bit? That it's like, oh my God, that's so brave. You can say it's really not. It
mm,
shouldn't be, you know? So I think that piece is something we all have to remember, because it can apply to to everyone. The reason why we all need to just be honest about our relationship with self-censorship and what we're seeing currently culturally, where we feel like we can say certain things and where we can't say certain things, is that yes, the default for many people will be, well, you just want an excuse to say something bigoted. Why does that have to be the only story? Because we're finding ourselves not being able to ask even the most basic questions, to even have
mm,
a back and forth with someone, unless they're someone of the right identity, where
mm,
it's just stifling our expression in so many ways, you know. um so I think something that allows me to continue doing the work that I do are those reminders of people thinking something too that would have been thought of 2 years ago is just a normal common sense thing. It's just seen as
mm,
being so brave. It just shows that um we're really weakening our sense of self, and we're really weakening our ability to think critically and to be brave communicators and to understand how the world truly operates, you know. Because I think a lot of us are also chronically online, so we think what happens online translates into the real world, but that's not actually the truth of it, and I
mm,
find that also concerning. But yeah, for me, self-censorship, maybe similar to you, reared its head in 2020 for sure. I was starting to kind of pick up on things that were happening around 2018, is when I started to notice that there were certain things I just felt that I couldn't say or shouldn't say as a Black person. Not even things that are controversial, just things that didn't quite make sense. And in some of the absolutes, um, especially around all white people being racist, it being the default. I just didn't
mm,
quite understand that. And I was like, okay, if I'm going to be on board, surely let me just understand what we actually mean by that. But you can't even pose the question or ask the question. You just have to full obedience or nothing. It's just when I started to realize that that was the name of the game. And couldn't get on board with that spiritually and emotionally and mentally. In terms of my behavior, I felt that there was no option. So I was on the train. I was with it. I didn't say any of those things out loud, but I co-signed it in different ways, in very small ways, to still show the people around me that I was still kind of on board with what we were doing. And I will always be for pushing back against racial injustice. I will always be for activism and social progression. That's never going to change. However, what I am not going to engage in is just this idea that I have to be completely obedient even when things don't make sense. That's just something that I won't do. But at the time, I felt like I didn't have any other choice but to be on board with every single thing that was that fell under the label of progression. And in 2020, I was still on that train. I was very much questioning. I was having private conversations with people around me who turned out they also felt the same, even though publicly you wouldn't have been able to tell that they were questioning, that they didn't agree anymore. So I started to just realize that there was something more concerning happening. And I always say that I'm so thankful for my experience with getting sober, finding the concept of self-sabotage, wanting to understand my own contradictions and where I was getting in my own way, because then I was able to coin the term collective sabotage to kind of describe what we call cancel culture. But I knew that there was something much bigger happening here. I was able to have that blueprint from getting sober, from understanding self-sabotage, to be able to understand what was happening on a more wider societal level. And then I just started speaking. Before I started speaking as loudly as I do today, I was sort of indirectly having a conversation. I was writing about the importance of being more open-minded. I was writing about the importance of not putting people on pedestals, because a lot of people were being put on pedestals because they had the right identity, not because what they were saying was actually true or it made sense, but they just had the right identity. And people were so afraid, and because of the guilt that people felt around their race, around their sex, around their identity, around their perceived or actual privilege, etc., there was a lot of guilt and shaming happening. So people were being led into different echo chambers because of it. So I started having the conversation, but kind of skirting around what was really happening. And then in the summer of 2020, I was like, no, it's a self-betrayal if I don't actually tell the truth, not the absolute truth, but whatever the truth for me is at this moment in time and what I have been experiencing in the past few years. So yeah, 2020 for me was a huge turning point, huge. And I know that it was for many people even listening to this.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we don't even truly understand, because people are keeping some of these, especially people who question things, they're keeping a lot of it private or within very small social groups. We're not actually seeing the true impact of what that is, I don't think. But to kind of bring this back more into a personal place, what do you think happens to people when we don't kind of show up authentically? And so it's not about sort of like saying what you want on social media or like questioning the status quo all the time, or like if that's what you want to do, then cool. But I think that's not what a lot of people listening want to do. It's more about, so like, what would you say to people who just notice themselves like censoring a little bit, holding information back a little bit, like even on in a private way, kind of not asking questions, kind of just agreeing, right? Because I think that's what I see most often is people going, well, all of these people think about this issue in this way, therefore that's what I think. And there's just this kind of lack of questioning going on there, of being like, hang on a minute, is this actually what I think? Or do I think this because this is what my tribe thinks? So with the people you coach, like how does that affect someone on a personal level when that's going on in this subtle way? And what can they do about it?
Mm, yeah. And you're so right. That's one of the most common things. I would say one of the most common ways in which self-censorship shows up for people across the board is the agreeing with things you don't actually agree with, because it's very easy to do. You can do it even in a body language way without even saying anything, even if it's just kind of nodding your head or just giving a signal to the people around you that you're on board with what they're saying, or to very loudly, which is what most people do now, to very loudly say, yeah, that's true, or to, you know, to just perform and reflect the other person's opinion back to them. One of the biggest costs, because I think what we're talking about here is cost. What is the true cost of self-censoring in this way? And I think this is an underrated cost that many people don't think of. It completely erodes your self-trust. And your self-trust is key for pretty much everything you are going to be doing in your life, for making the right decision, even believing, trusting that you can make the right decision, you know, trusting. I always use the language of, you have to be able to trust that what you want to say is worth taking responsibility for. So imagine not having anything that you think is worth taking responsibility for. So you crush your ability to take emotional risks and to actually deepen intimacy with someone, whether it's a friend, whether it's a colleague, whether it's your mother, whether it's your child, your partner. You have to be willing to take an emotional risk. And it doesn't even have to be a big one, like a huge one where you lose everything, because that's where the mind goes to, that very binary thing of, but if I say this, I will lose everything. I will lose this person. They will disagree with me. They'll reject me. They'll abandon me. Why does that have to be the only story? What would happen if you were to risk experiencing another story where actually you become more connected to that person? And even deeper than that, when I come back to the self-trust, to even get to that point of taking that emotional risk, you need to be able to hold the discomfort within yourself, which is completely normal. When someone in front of you says something you don't agree with, but then you have to be able to spot that actually there could be an opportunity for me to be honest, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. Always look at those moments where the stakes are really low. It really doesn't have to be a big thing. Maybe it's a TV show, maybe it's an interview. Someone says, I don't fucking like Joe Rogan, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, actually, I've listened to an interview that he did and it was pretty good. Have you listened to a full interview? Like, and the way that you approach, right? Because most people actually have not listened to a full interview. That's a good question to ask. Right? It's about like the tone and the delivery in which you say something. And it can be a very small thing. It can be around the table where a few people agree with something, a few people don't. And you say, actually, no, I don't think about it in that way. It can be really simple. And maybe someone will ask a follow-up question and you can say, I need more time to think about it, but I just know that I don't know if I completely agree with that. And it can really be that simple. But you need to be able to trust yourself even to do that. But how are you going to trust yourself when you don't take emotional risks? So I would say that's one of the biggest costs that I see, and it could be language that could be useful for anyone listening, that anytime you agree with things that you don't agree with, and I'm not talking about a social filter where actually within the context of the situation, it might be better to say, I don't know, because there are ways to not put forward an opinion that you just don't have the capacity to face conversation, and it's just not the time and place. It's not the right audience. You don't actually have to agree. You could say, you know what, I don't know. Well, I don't have an opinion on that. Or you can turn the question back to them. What do you think? Or I haven't thought about that. There are ways to say I don't agree without saying I don't agree. You know what I mean? So I think it can be a fun game to realize that it doesn't have to be that I don't agree and you get into debate. That's not the only option, because we think it is,
Yeah.
And I empathize with a lot of us because sometimes you just don't have the energy. I promise you, with people that are in my life, people that I know, with family, sometimes I just don't have the capacity. I really can't be bothered to get into it. So I'm not going to give you my stance and what I can't be bothered.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that right now. So I'll just say, I don't know. Well, you know what? I just haven't thought about that. And then people will move on. We're so self-centered that a lot of the time we don't give a shit. We'll move on to the next. Okay, you don't know. What do you think? You know, I think
Yeah.
there's so many ways, but you need to have that foundation of self-trust. I trust myself enough, the situation right now, to say I don't know. I trust myself to, because there's so much power in that. I think there's also something egoic in that we always want to know. We think we need to have an answer. We think we need to respond right now. But you can also pause. Something that I do, and I don't have shame around it. I will pause and I will think. Even if I pause for a while and then I say, you know what, I don't know. And then it's anticlimactic. I'm okay with that. I don't mind. You know?
Just don't do
So
it in
I
your
think,
Hollywood film. Just don't do that.
just don't do it in the film. But I think, Hazel, if I'm to bring this and just keep it very simple, one of the biggest costs to this, especially for your listeners and what they are doing in the world and who they are as people, is it will erode your self-trust in ways that you won't even be able to notice. And it can impact everything else you're doing, because when you don't trust yourself in one area, even in the simplest things, it will spill over into other areas, into really big areas of your life where you need to be able to be a good decision maker, where you need to have good, fantastic discernment, where you need to be able to think on the spot, you know, where you need to be able to step in when something goes wrong and you need to make how would you do that if you don't entirely trust yourself?
Yeah, no, I think that's so powerful. And you know, it's interesting, in climbing we talk about how to manage physical risk a lot of the time, but I also do a lot of coaching around social fears. And a lot of the social fear stuff is social risk. And that's kind of what we're talking about in a way, right? It's like,
Wow.
you know,
Yes.
is there a risk? I think more and more we start to feel like there is a risk when we speak our minds, whether that's about something political or even just, you know, in a climbing environment, like I don't want to do that climb, or I don't feel up to it, or I would rather if you did this as my climbing partner rather than this. There's social risk there and social fear. And in many ways, it's social fear is so much more powerful than fear around physical danger, because social
Yes.
so and I know we're short on time, but social stuff is our safety, because without others, we are not safe. And so I think that's it really
Right.
gets to something deep within us where, you know, if we don't have others, that's just the worst thing that might happen to us. So I think it comes from
Yeah.
that fear, comes from that. And so even if you're kind of
Yes.
not resonating with some of the more political stuff here, if you are someone that often agrees with others around whatever it is, I think what you're saying there about personal trust is massive. And it's so tied to
Yes.
other social fears that may affect you in other ways as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And then something else I would offer to tie into this is maybe I invite people to start thinking about it differently, right? Because the idea of an emotional risk and becoming a better, braver communicator, blah, 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 can sound fantastic, because it is. It can sound great. And when you're motivated and inspired, you can really want to step into that. But I want you to think about your micro interactions, kind of the mundane interactions that you have every single day, because that's where I think the best training ground for everything we're speaking of, which can sound so big, just bring it back to the tiny little interactions. All of us have, I would hope we have at least one person, whether it's your partner, a sibling, family member, colleague, someone you climb with. Choose one person you can start taking really small emotional risks with when it comes to you cultivating that braver. And I want you to think about it in the sense of, when I take that little emotional risk, because I don't advise taking the big ones just yet. You really have to build that muscle, right? In the same way that you did with climbing, you needed a starting point before getting to where you are now. And it's a lower commitment, so it's very doable if you a challenge. Pick that one person, and you don't even have to tell them. just start taking braver emotional risks where you share a little bit more of your opinion, where maybe before you would have agreed, but now you don't agree. Try the techniques that I mentioned around, if it feels too much to say, I don't agree, just respond a little bit differently. Oh, I haven't thought about that. Or I feel a little bit differently. Or even I'm going to get back to you. And then I'd love to continue the discussion. Like, and I'm really glad you brought this up. Or even when you feel a bit uncomfortable, something that I do is I will say it to the other person that, oh, I can feel myself getting a little bit uncomfortable. I wonder why. Let me think about that. So I will like, there's so many different ways, but I want you to think of taking an emotional risk and building intimacy. The more you do it, the more you build intimacy. Because Hazel, you're so right. The deepest fear that we have is being cast out of the group. We're never going to be able to extract that out of ourselves. It's actually really important that we have that. But also it can work against us, you know, because it's our default in a lot of ways. And it's fine if you still have that default of being like, oh, but if I say this, but just start observing and then just shift your behavior in a really subtle way. But I want you to think of taking those emotional risks as intimacy building. Because I think even just that language and that mindset allows for you to approach it a little bit differently. And again, it's those small little moments. It doesn't have to be the big things.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Cool. All right. Well, I know you have to go, but that's been amazing. I think we covered everything
Yes.
that I thought were the key things. And yeah, I just love your perspective and take on things. And I think that, people will get a lot out of it. So thanks so much.
Thank you. And we can have a part two. We'll have to have
That'd
a
be
part two
great.
in the future because
Yeah.
I think these conversations are ever evolving. They are constantly
Mm,
evolving. And I'd be very curious to know more, maybe like in a future conversation about, yeah, just how specifically some of these things continue to show up with you and your community, and how some of your cultural and general observations are influencing the way you work with your clients and the way that you even lead yourself. So I think these are ever evolving conversations. So I love it when I can continue them with people.
well, yeah, I'm always open for a part two. So that'd be great.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Thanks a lot.